Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and welcome everyone to our sixth lecture in the Project Management Professional course. And by this lecture, we almost cover 40% of our course, right? So as you see, days go by quickly, and I know that the beginning is probably the most difficult thing of any journey. But again, it's like you build muscles. If you start building muscles, if you start going to the gym, in the first days, you feel pain, right? Because this is something that you're not used to. So you feel pain everywhere in your body, you feel pain in your muscles and so on. If you can overcome this pain and, create this habit of going to the gym every couple of days, every other day, then you start to have this kind of consistency where you actually, again, develop a habit that you cannot even later on give it up, which is something very good because you develop the habit of learning, of acquiring new information, of acquiring new knowledge. And again, it's like in the gym, then it becomes something that runs in your blood. You need to do that all the time. You need to continue doing what you're doing, whether it's in the gym or whether it's in the course, and it starts to become even more fun. So I hope that by reaching this lecture, you have developed this habit, and I really hope that you still find these lectures fun. First of all, you have learned many things, I hope, and those things will help you eventually in your, in your career, in developing your career paths. So let's remind you quickly of what we covered in the last lecture. So in the last lecture, we started discussing the initiation of the project, and we covered basically the governance, setting up a proper governance framework for the project, the vision, setting up a clear vision for the project and emphasizing on the vision throughout the project, and developing a project charter, a high-level document that formally authorizes the existence of a project and allows the project manager to start formally planning for the project. And we reached the fourth point, which is the stakeholders. So these are the subjects that we have covered in the last lecture. Now, one thing to note that would help you follow with the course, with the process chart, you will always find here the process where these information relates. So for instance, we are discussing initiating a project, right? And we're discussing setting up a governance framework. Now, what is the process that relates to governance and setting up a governance framework? This is the first process of the 49 processes of the PMBOK Guides version 6, which is develop project charter. So now whenever you see develop project charter, then you know that the knowledge here, or what we are explaining here, is or relates to this process and so on. So this is what we did what we will be doing all the course. You will always find the name of the process in the bottom of the page, so you know exactly what process we are discussing, and you can follow that on the process chart that we have explained earlier. Okay, so again, we discussed the governance, applying governance to the project life cycle, the escalation paths, and the toll gates or governance gates or kill points. We discussed the vision, the mission of the project, overview statement, the project charter, and what are the contents, the usual contents of the project charter, the kickoff meeting, what's the purpose of the kickoff meeting, and what are the things that we usually discuss in the kickoff meeting, and some agile considerations like the product box exercise that helps setting the vision of the project, and some specifics relating to the agile project kickoff meeting. And we now continue with discussing the other process that we do in initiating the project, which is, or which relates to the stakeholders. So it's very important, actually, right from the start of the project, to start identify the project stakeholders and document these stakeholders, those stakeholders. So in this chapter, we will discuss who the project stakeholders are, what categories can we find in this, what kind of categories can I classify the stakeholders of the project, the stakeholders identification and analysis processes, the influence matrix, the salience model as a model that we use also to categorize again the stakeholders, the power grids, another model for classifying the project stakeholders, and documenting the stakeholders in a document that we will call stakeholder register. Okay, so let's start by defining stakeholders. Who are the project stakeholders? Project stakeholders, I think we already defined them. Any individual, group, or even organization, any entity basically, that may affect or be affected or perceive itself to be affected by the project, by a decision of a project, by an activity, by an outcome, by the project as a whole. If we are discussing stakeholders in the program, then this applies to the program. If we are discussing stakeholders in a portfolio, then this applies to the portfolio as well. Okay, so it's anyone, any organization, any entity, any individual, any group that affect or might be affected by the project or one of its outcomes or activities. Examples include the project management staff, of course, the team, the sponsor, the client, the users, the suppliers. Again, anyone that can impact or be impacted by the project and the project objectives. So this can include, these are the common categories of stakeholders: the sponsors of the project governance board, the top management, right? The customers, the users that will use the product of the project, the sellers that we will probably contract to help us in the project, the business partners, other departments and organizational groups if they have this interest and impact in the project, other functional managers, other stakeholders. For instance, you are building a house and you have neighbors, and those neighbors started to get annoyed by the building. So would you consider them stakeholders in the project? The answer is yes, because they are impacted by the project, right? They might file a complaint against you because you're disturbing, you're making disturbance in the neighborhood. Okay, so again, take the definition and work on the definition. Okay, again, it's very important to start identifying the stakeholders as soon as possible in the project. Even when you're developing the project charter, you start identifying stakeholders, because you remember that one of the things that we can include in the project charter is key stakeholders, right? So basically you have started identifying those stakeholders as soon as possible. Now, will this effort stop here in the project initiation? No, actually, you will continue identifying stakeholders throughout the project life cycle. So whenever you discover a new stakeholder, you identify the stakeholder, you analyze the stakeholder, and you document the stakeholder information. Okay, so it's an ongoing process, and that's why we call them processes, right? All of these 49 processes that we have explained or shown you on the process chart They're called processes because you don't do them only once. No, you do them whenever you need to do them again. Okay, so you identify stakeholders, and the process name again is here in the bottom of the page. So identify stakeholders as a process does not take place only in the beginning of the project or the initiation of the project. You will continue to identify stakeholders as long as you need throughout the project life cycle. Okay, and for that reason, you need to update the stakeholder register whenever you discover a new stakeholder, for instance, right? Okay, and this actually applies to all project documents and plans, as we will also explain later on in details. So as a golden rule, all project management plans and documents are regularly updated and are live documents. We call them live documents because they are regularly updated until the end of the project. All of the project documents and the project management plans are subject to updates, except actually for one document. There is only one document that you're not allowed to update. You develop that document only once. Yes, which is the project charter, because the project charter actually represents the project ID. It's like an ID of the project. So if you want to modify something in the idea, it's going to be like a very core modification of core attributes of the project, and this cannot be done. If you want to alter something that is very specific and that is very essential in the project, then what you need to do is actually to close the current project and to start a new project with a new charter. You cannot modify the project charter. Okay, it's like modifying your ID. You cannot do that easily, right? So if you want to change some of the objectives of the project or some of the business objectives or some of the, I don't know, the business case has changed, for instance, or the benefits have changed, then you need to close the current project and start a new project with a new charter, okay? Now, what's the idea of stakeholders identification, and why do I need to identify those stakeholders? Now, this is very important job, and I consider it personally a very important success factor to manage your project successfully. You need to identify those stakeholders. It's a matter of very important intelligence that you need. You need to understand who is impacting your project and how they are impacting your project, and what is the level of impact and what is the level of interest that each stakeholder has. This is very important intelligence for your project in order to engage them properly, in order to manage their expectations properly, in order to create the right relationships with them, in order to track whatever issues you might face with them. If you also can remember, we mentioned earlier that when you don't identify some of these stakeholders, you will be faced with an increased number of change requests, because when they come to you and you haven't identified them before and you don't know what they're expecting or what they're requiring in the project, they have demands. They have requirements that you need to include in the project. And for that reason, they will submit change requests, right? So two documents that are commonly used when managing stakeholders are the change logs and the issue logs. Issues of not properly identifying stakeholders and changes and change requests that you are receiving from stakeholders there that were not identified sooner enough. Okay, so it's very important to, again, to identify the stakeholders in the project as soon as possible. Now, while you do that, you also need to take into consideration the two important things that we mentioned all of the time, especially in the planning phase, right? You need to take into consideration the OPAs, organizational process assets. So you go back to the previous project files, to the previous lessons learned, and you check who were the stakeholders in those projects and what were their level of impact or level of interest. Were they supportive of the project or resistant to the project? I need to understand that. And the AEFs, the enterprise environmental factors. So for instance, you might have to obtain some clearances from legal entities. So those legal entities are considered stakeholders with high level of impact. If they don't give you the clearances that you need to start working in your project, you cannot start working in your project, right? So you need to understand what are the internal and external factors that affect, influence your project, and who are the stakeholders that might be engaged in this influence. And for that reason, remember this rule: you don't select the project stakeholders. You cannot select your project stakeholders. We wish you can. Any project manager wishes they can select the project stakeholders. Now, some of the project stakeholders you can select, like the project team. The project team are also stakeholders and you can select them. You basically select them. But other stakeholders, other important stakeholders, you cannot select them. They are imposed on you, like the project sponsor, like the other functional managers, like, again, people that come from legal entities that you need to contact or communicate with in order to have permissions or clearances, like your neighbors, for instance, if you're working again in building a tower or something. So most of the stakeholders, you don't basically select them, they are imposed on you. And you can select some of the stakeholders, like the project team, like the suppliers, the sellers that you want to work with. Okay, does that make sense to you, everyone? So while working in the project, there is this influence matrix where stakeholders influence other stakeholders and influence other groups of stakeholders. And you need to understand these influences and you need to watch these influences. And again, you need to manage those influences in a way that you gain support, the required support from these stakeholders to your project, and that you try to overcome the resistance. If there is any resistance from some of the stakeholders, you try to overcome the resistance of those stakeholders by properly managing the influences. Now, what type of influences? What is the direction of influences? We have upwards influences. So the project and the project team, the project manager can influence the senior management by the outcomes, by the performance of the project, by the activities that we are doing in the project, or downwards. So the project manager influences the team members or specialists or suppliers or contractors working in the project. Outwards, again, there is some influence towards the legal entities that we require clearances from. There is influences towards other external stakeholders, suppliers as well, that we might work with in the project. And there are sidewards influences between the project itself and the project team and other projects in the organization. because we might share the same resources, we might share the same equipment, we share also the same organizational culture, we share also the same OPAs, for instance. So there's also a sidewards influence. So these are, or this is what we call the influence matrix. You need to consider all the directions of influence and how to manage them properly in order to have the proper, again, support, or the proper level of support that you need in your project, okay? Now, after identifying the stakeholders, you need to analyze them, to understand them more, to classify them in groups where you start developing a strategy how to deal with each group of those stakeholders. Now, one of the common models that you can use to analyze your project stakeholders is what we call the salience model. The salience model was developed by Boston Consulting Group. The salience model consists of 3 circles. The circle of power. So those are the stakeholders that have a high level of power, of impact on the project. They can't stop the project. They can prevent any progress in the project with the high level impact that they have. And we have the circle of legitimacy. So those are the stakeholders that have legitimate requirements that we need to listen to and that we need to fulfill. And you have the circle of urgency. Those are the stakeholders that have this, you know, kind of urgency. They always nag about their requirements. They always want their requirements to be developed as soon as possible. So this is the circle of urgency. Now, the intersection of those 3 circles will yield 7 types of stakeholders. And for this reason, we call this model the 7D as well, because we name all the categories starting with the D letter. So for instance, here you have the first category of stakeholder, which is the dormant stakeholders. Now, those are stakeholders that have power in the project, they have high level of impact, but they don't have legitimacy. We should not, or we are not bound to listen to their requirements because they don't have this legitimacy to impose some requirements on us on the project. And they're not also in the urgency. They don't have this urgency of meeting their requirements in the project. So we call this group the dormant. They're like sleeping, and you better keep them sleeping. Try not to wake them up, because if you wake them up, they might, you know, create problems for you. So just try to keep them sleeping, okay? They have the power, but they are not in the legitimacy circle. They are not in the urgency circle, okay? They're dormant. For instance, for example, who can be in this category? Again, for instance, if you need a clearance from the municipality, then the municipality or the specific office in the municipality that is supposed to give you the clearance is or has high level of power, but they don't have legitimacy or urgency. They will not ask you to do whatever they need immediately. It's up to you whether you want to fulfill their requirements quickly or not. So basically, you can call them dormant, okay? So this is one category. Other categories, for instance, the discretionary. The discretionary are stakeholders who have legitimate requirements that we need to fulfill, but they don't have the power to, you know, to make us or force us to fulfill those requirements. And they don't have this urgency. They don't care actually if you fulfill the requirements or not. So we call them discretionary. another group demanding. Those are people who are nagging all the time about their requirements, although they are not in the legitimacy. They don't have legitimate requirement that we need to fulfill, and they don't have power to force us to do their requirements, but they only do, what they only do is demanding only. They demand all the time their requirements to be met. So we call them the demanding group. Now, other groups, for instance, notice the intersection between power and urgency. So people that have power and have urgency, but they're not in the legitimacy circle, so they don't have legitimate requirements that we need to fulfill, but they have power and they have urgency. So we call them what? Dangerous people, because they nag all the time about their requirements and they have power. They can, they can impact the proceeding of your project. So we call them dangerous. For instance, again, people with legitimate requirements and with urgency, but without power, we call them dependent, because they depend on other stakeholders' power to make us fulfill their requirements. They don't have the power to force us to do that. Now, the most important group, of course, is the intersection of the three circles, right? So those are people with power, with legitimacy, and with urgency. This is basically the customer, for instance, right? They have legitimate requirements that we need to fulfill. They have power because they are paying the expenses of the project, and they have urgency. Usually the customers want their job to be done as soon as possible, right? So we call them the core or definitive, if we want to follow the 7D. So we call this group the definitive stakeholders. Okay, so you have, again, 7 types of categories that you can classify your stakeholders to and develop a strategy to how to tackle each group. What should I do with the dormant people? What should I do with the discretionary people? What should I do with the dependent people? What should I do with the dangerous people? Okay. Now, the salience model is fairly newly developed and is not that commonly used in the project. What is really commonly used in the projects in stakeholder analysis is the power grids, and especially the power interest grid. So you have this grid where we express the level of power vertically and the level of interest horizontally. So you get 4 categories of stakeholders. The first category is stakeholders that have high level of power but low level of interest. So they have the power, but they don't have the interest. Again, some office in the municipality that you need to get a clearance from. So they have high power, but they don't have high interest. They have low interest in your project. Okay, so this is the first category. What's your strategy? Probably to deal with them. Keep them satisfied, right? Like the dormant that we discussed earlier. Keep them satisfied. Don't make them angry, because if you make them angry, then they can probably stop your project. Don't give you the required clearance to proceed in your project, okay? The other group, which is the most important group, has high level of power and high level of interest. So you need to manage them closely. Now, who can be in this group? Who can in the project have this high level of power and high level of interest? The project sponsor, right? The customer, the top management, all of them can be classified in this category because they have this high level of power and they have this high level of interest, right? And my strategy is to manage them closely. Interest, the third now group, people that have high interest level but low level of power. So they're pretty much interested in the project, but they don't have the power to impact the project. Like, for instance, who? Suppliers and the users of the product, of the project. They have high interest. They want, the suppliers, for instance, they want to work with you. They want to provide you with their services, but they don't have the high level impact. They cannot impact your decisions or whether you will contract them or contract other suppliers. Now, what's the strategy to deal with this group of stakeholders? Keep them informed. Keep them informed, updated of the proceedings of the project. And the lowest priority group of stakeholders is the stakeholders with low level of power and low level of interest. For instance, the labor working in the project, say they don't have a high level of power, they don't have a high level of interest in your project, they're just working, to get their salaries at the end of the month. So what you do, basically, the strategy to deal with them is to monitor them, right? Now, this is a more common model of classifying stakeholders and setting a strategy, a proper strategy to deal with this or with these stakeholders groups, okay? You might use the power interest grid, so power and interest, or sometimes they use also the power and influence. Influence is the people that can influence the performance of the project without having power. Like, for instance, you have an expert in your project. So if you lose this expert in your project, this expert has an influence in your project because he leads or she leads a very important role in the project. So if we lose this expert, for instance, for any reason, then we'll have issues and we'll have problems and the performance will decrease, for instance. So they have a high influence without having high powers. They don't have a formal position, They don't have the ability to, for instance, to stop your project. No, but they have influence, okay? So you can also classify your stakeholders considering their level of power and their level of influence. But again, the most common model is the power interest grid. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, any question? So let's take 10 minutes break for prayers and get back to you after that. 10 minutes and we will be back. Thank you. So we started discussing identifying stakeholders in the project. We mentioned that this is a very important step that the project manager needs to take right from the start in order to get to know who are the stakeholders that impact or can be impacted by the project and what their level of interest are. And then, while identifying your stakeholders, you need to analyze them as well. You need to understand, again, their level of interest, their level of impact, their level of influence. You need to understand the influence directions, and you need to classify those stakeholders into groups that you can develop strategies to deal with. And we actually explained two common models, or one not pretty common model, which is the salience model, and the other common model, which is the power interest grid. Okay, any questions so far? So when you're done identifying and analyzing your project stakeholders, you need to document that, right? Now again, remember what we mentioned about the agile project management. The comprehensive documentation is something that we do in the traditional project management, while in agile project management, again, documentation is lightweight, is barely sufficient. We do it at the last responsible moment. We do it just because if it's a requirement by the management, for instance, or by regulatory, then we do it for that reason. So again, when we explain documentation in this course, we usually mean the traditional approaches, because the traditional approaches rely heavily on documentation and comprehensive documentation, while again the agile approaches use barely sufficient documentation. So you need to document those stakeholders in a stakeholder register. Now, this is one example of a project of, a stakeholder register, where you have, of course, who's the project manager, what's the project phase that we are in, for instance, and then stakeholders' names. Now, you should have names here, actually. You should have names of the people here, and then their role. So this is the project sponsor, this is a project lead, this is the product manager, this is the PMO or someone in the PMO, the program manager, for instance, this is the development manager, and so on. And their contacts, so you need their contact information just in case you need to reach out to them. And the category, probably if you have classified them again into groups, then you would indicate the category or the group here. Their level of interest, again, their level of influence, their level of impact, if you wish to, and their main expectations and their main or high level requirements. Now, this is high level description of what their requirements are, because later on we will be gathering those requirements in details when we develop the project scope. But now we can start by, identifying the high level requirements of these stakeholders and the expectations. What do they expect in the project? What kind of deliverables they expect? What kind of impact they expect in the project, and so on. So this is an example of a stakeholder register. Now, again, remember that you don't develop this document only once. This document is a live document. This document is subject to continuous update throughout the project life cycle and whenever we identify new stakeholders. Okay, is that fair enough? Okay, so let's have again a new group of questions and review a little bit with you. Okay, let's start with the first question. You've noticed that you are CIO, Chief Information Officer, shows all the signs of being a good leader. Which of the following statements are true regarding leaders? Select 3. So there is only one statement that is not correct regarding leaders. Leaders use referent power. Leaders impart vision. Leaders are concerned with strategic plans. Leaders are concerned with satisfying stakeholder needs. 3 of these statements are correct and 1 is incorrect. Which one is incorrect, do you think? Is it C? No, because we mentioned specifically, right? Leaders are concerned with the horizon, they have vision, so they have this strategic plan in order to achieve the vision, right? They don't use referent power. We mentioned that they use their good relationship with other people in order to motivate them and in order to convince them to do what they want to do. So basically A is correct. So which one is not correct, you think? Have you ever heard of the saying that goes, if you want to make everyone happy, don't be a leader, sell ice cream. If you want to make everyone happy, sell ice cream, don't be a leader, right? So what does that mean? Leaders are actually not concerned directly with satisfying stakeholders' needs. They're concerned with achieving a vision. Now, this vision might satisfy a good number of stakeholders, but might as well not satisfy other stakeholders as well. So leaders really don't concentrate on satisfying all stakeholders' needs. No, what they're concerned with is to achieve the vision that they have set themselves to achieve. Okay, does that make sense? It's a little bit tricky question, right? Okay, here's another question. Tom is a project manager working for a reputable editorial agency specializing in exam preparation. He and his team use agile approaches to manage projects. Because of the company's growth, 3 new project managers have been hired, and Tom has stepped up to mentor, so act as a mentor for the new hires. Given their limited experience with agile, Tom decides to walk them through the 4 values and 12 principles that define agile in order to help them adapt an agile mindset. What is Tom reviewing with the project managers, with the newly hired project managers? What document would he use? The Agile Charter, the Agile Principles, the Agile Guide, the Agile Manifesto. Yes, you got that correct. So it's the Agile Manifesto that contains the 4 core values and the 12 supporting or guiding principles. Correct. Excellent. Another question. Janet is a project manager for the consulting division of Java Architects. She has just been informed that the proposal she provided for a prospective client last week has gained approval from the company's governance board, and a project charter has been approved. So the project charter that she has developed has been approved. Good news for her. Okay. What activity is most likely to be carried out next? Facilitation of iteration planning, creation of the project's backlog, identification of stakeholders, development of the project charter. Excellent, very easy, right? Identification of stakeholders, correct. A project manager works within a department that has a PMO. The primary purpose of the PMO organization is to ensure that the department receives the support needed to deliver successful project outcomes, as well as remain compliant with published project governance requirements. What type of PMO is this? Is it an agile PMO, supportive PMO, controlling PMO, or a directive PMO? What is the correct answer, do you think? Excellent. Yes, it's a controlling PMO. Don't look only at the support function that this PMO provides, because there's another important word, which is the compliant, right? So there's a control over projects to make sure that they comply. So this is a controlling PMO. Correct, excellent. Okay, next question. Which of the following statements about project governance frameworks are true? Select 3. Project governance specifies operational, legal, and risk policies. Project governance guides project management activities in order to achieve intended goals. Project governance provides stakeholders with structure, processes, and decision-making models for the project. Project governance clarifies how changes to the project are addressed when beyond the authority of the project manager. 3 statements are correct, 1 is not correct. Which one is not correct, do you think? Is it D? But governance really clarifies how we deal with changes, right? So D is correct. Is it B? But the governance guides, right? It acts like a framework that guides the activities to achieve goals. Yes. So basically, B, C, D are correct. The only statement that is not correct is that the governance specifies operational, legal, and risk policy, especially when you read the word operational, right? Because this is a project. So why should the governance be concerned with operational policies? Is that correct or not? Operation is different from project, right? Okay. Okay. Next question. Martha has just told that she will be assigned as a project manager, has been just told that she will be assigned as a project manager for the new office expansion project. After the project charter is created and approved, she begins the process of performing stakeholder analysis. She decides to group stakeholders by their level of authority and level of concern. What type of classification model has she chosen to use? Power influence grid, or power interest grid, or influence impact grid, or salience model? What is it? Yes, it's basically the level of authority is the power, the level of concern is the interest, right? So it's the power interest grid. Correct. Another question. Which of the following best describes the purpose of carrying out activities associated with the planning stakeholder engagement? We haven't actually arrived at this point when where we explain the stakeholder engagement plan, but I think you can figure this out. So why do we carry out activities associated with the planning stakeholder engagement? A, to identify project stakeholders regularly and analyze and document relevant information regarding their interest, involvement, interdependencies, influence, and potential impact on project success. B, to communicate and work with stakeholders to meet their needs and expectations, address their issues, foster appropriate stakeholder involvement. C, to monitor project stakeholder relationships and tailor strategy for engaging stakeholders through modification of engagement strategies and plans. D, to develop approaches to involve project stakeholders based on their needs, expectations, interests, and potential impacts on the project. What do you think, B or C? What is the purpose of developing a stakeholder engagement plan, or is it D? Yes, it's D. So to develop approaches. Now this is a plan, right? So we want to develop approaches, and it's an engagement plan. So the purpose of engagement plan is to involve project stakeholders based on their needs, expectations, interests, and potential impact on the project. Yes, D is the correct answer. Okay, next question. The project manager has just determined that 3 functional managers with a high interest in the project hold a particularly high degree of influence in the allocation of enterprise resources. Where is the project manager likely to document this information? Stakeholder analysis, resource management plan, stakeholder engagement plan, stakeholder register. So where we document the level of informance, the level of influence of those functional managers and the level of interest. Is it stakeholder analysis, resource management plan, stakeholder engagement plan, or stakeholder register? Now you need to differentiate between a tool. This is a tool, not a document. Stakeholder analysis is not a document, it's a tool. And the question here is about the document, right? So what is the document that we use to document the results of stakeholder analysis? It's the stakeholder register, correct? Okay, we need to distinguish between the tool and the document. Okay, next question. Which environmental factor should you pay close attention to when carrying out the identify stakeholders process? Lessons learned and historical repositories, company culture and organizational structure, existing policies, procedures, and guidelines, stakeholder registers from past similar projects. Which environmental factor should you consider? What do you think? Is lessons learned an enterprise environmental factor? Lessons learned is not an EF, it's OPA, right? Lessons learned and stakeholders registers from past similar projects and existing policies, procedures, and guidelines. All of them are what? OPAs, organizational process assets. While the only enterprise environmental factor here is what? The company culture and organizational structure that makes some people have high level of impact on my project, while other people don't have, for instance, that high level of impact on my project, right? So B, correct answer is B. This is the EEF here. A, C, D, all are OPAs. Okay, a matching question. Match the Agile project charter component to the question it addresses. So what you can have in Agile project charter is project vision, flow of work, release criteria, project purpose. Now, what does each of these relate to? What does done mean for the project? How are we going to work together? Who benefits and how? Why are we doing this project? Let's start from here. The project vision, what do you think? It relates to which, it answers which of these questions? 4. Are you sure? What about the project purpose? Three. Okay, what about the flow of work? Flow of work is what? Yes, 2. How are we going to work together? And the release criteria? Yes, what does done, the criteria of releasing the product, right? Okay, so the only confusing part here is a little bit is the vision and the purpose, right? So what do you think again? The purpose of the project is what? Is it 4 or 3? Is 3, right? The purpose. What is the purpose of any project, basically? Why do we launch projects? In order to obtain some benefits, right? This is the main purpose of launching any project, right? So the purpose is to get some benefits. The vision is that the reason that we want to do this project to become #1 mobile makers in the market, for instance. Okay? Hope that is, or that makes sense to you. Okay? Excellent. So with this, we conclude the first generic phase of the project, which is the initiation phase. So we concluded one of the 5 process groups. Any question about the initiation? It was quick and easy, right? So again, the initiation is setting up a governance framework, setting a vision for the project, developing a project charter, identifying and analyzing stakeholders. Okay. Now let's move on to the next process group and next generic phase of the project, which is the planning phase. And as you have seen when we explained the process chart, this is the largest group of processes, right? This is the group that contains all the colors, all the knowledge areas are there, because when you develop a plan for the project, you want to make sure that you develop the plan for all the aspects of the project, that you develop a plan for the scope, for the schedule, for the cost, for the quality, for all the aspects of the project, right? Yes, Muhammad is asking, does identify stakeholders applies in Agile? It applies in all projects, but again, you don't do that kind of thorough analysis and thorough documentation. You do it roughly. You need to understand who your project stakeholders are, and you might do some, quick documentation, but not that kind of thorough and again comprehensive documentation. Okay. So again, the Agile Charter is lightweight, and if you want, it's not obligatory. If you want to develop something to document the stakeholders, you can develop a lightweight document, a lightweight stakeholder register. Okay. So now let's move on to the planning phase or stage of the project, where we discuss developing a project management plan that consists of several subsidiary plans and baseline and the project artifacts. We will explain what is meant by project artifacts. So in this chapter, we will cover the principle of progressive elaboration, the project management plan components, and the project artifacts. So let's start with the very essential and very important principle that you need to pay attention to while developing the project management plan, which is the progressive elaboration. Now, we mentioned before that when you start the project, you start with only few information, with few data about your project, right? You know only little about your project. The level of uncertainty is high at the beginning of the project. And as we proceed with the project, more information flow in, more data flow in, more understanding of the project specifics come in, and we understand more about the project. So basically, this reflects directly to the project management plan, because when you start developing a project management plan, you basically develop a high-level project management plan. And this is what we started to do, right? When we developed the project charter, we mentioned that it's a high-level document with high-level information about the project. But now when we move on to the planning, and for instance, we start developing a scope for the project, then we get to know more about the project, especially when we decompose, for instance, the scope into small pieces, then we understand a lot about the project. And then we move on to developing a schedule of the project, and we identify the activities that we need to do in the project, then we understand more again about the project. And then when we move on to develop the cost and budget of the project, again, we get more information and we understand more. So as you see, as we proceed in the project and in developing the project management plan, more information become available and more accurate estimates can be developed. So we have this progressive elaboration of the project management plan. So basically, you don't have, or you cannot develop a detailed project management plan right from the beginning. You start with high level, And as you move on through planning from scope to schedule to cost to quality to risks to communication to procurement, more details and more details and more details become available, and you take all of those details and you update again and re-update all of these plans, and you make sure of the integration of those plans, that there is no conflict between those plans, until you cover all the planning aspects for your project, and you create the master project management plan that covers all the aspects of your project. That is a detailed plan that you can take to your management or to your customer so they can approve it, right? So this is the concept of progressive elaboration. As we move forward in the project, we can elaborate more and add more details to the project management plan, okay? And this is done through what we call the principle of rolling wave planning. So there's a wave one of planning that produces a high-level plan. And then when we move forward, we discover more details and we go through another wave of planning. And then again, we discover more details and we go through another wave of planning, and so on. So planning and again, updating the plan, updating the plan, updating the plan through what we call a rolling wave planning. Because of, this happens because of what? Because of this principle, because of the progressive elaboration principle. Okay, does that make sense? And for that reason, for this specific reason, we need to update all the project management plan and update all the project documents, as I mentioned earlier, right? All of the project management plans and project documents are subject to continuous update, except, of course, for the first document, which is the project charter. Now, by definition, what is the project management plan? By definition, it's the document that describes how the project will be executed, how the project will be monitored, how the project will be controlled, and how the project will be closed. And I'm repeating this how, because I want you to know that it's not only about execution, because some people think that planning is only about how to execute. No, planning is not only about how to execute, it's also about how to monitor and how to control and how to close the project. All of these details should be included in the project management plan. Okay? So you need to understand that well. Now, the project management plan is not, again, one plan, as we mentioned earlier. It actually consists of several subsidiary plans and baselines to cover, again, all the aspects of the project. So, for instance, you need to plan for the scope of the project. So you need to develop a scope management plan. And you need to plan for the requirements, how they will be collected, analyzed, prioritized, tracked, traced. So you need requirements management plan. And you need to plan for the schedule, how we will develop the schedule, who is responsible for developing the schedule, what is the tool that we will use to develop the schedule, who will update the schedule, who will track the schedule, how we will do this. So schedule management plan. Cost management plan as well. How is cost to be developed? How is budget to be developed, approved, tracked, and so on. Quality management plan. What are the quality metrics that we will use in the project? How will we identify them? How we will track them? How will we do a quality assurance, for instance, and quality control in the project, and so on. So you need a quality management plan. resource management plan, communication management plan, risk management plan, stakeholder engagement plan that we have just mentioned earlier, right? How to keep the stakeholders engaged and involved positively in the project. What are the strategies? What are the approaches to make them engaged throughout the project life cycle? Configuration management plan, we will explain it later on. Change management plan, how will we handle the change requests in the project? And compliance management plan, how to make sure that we comply with all the legal and organizational requirements, for instance, in the project, right? So you need to create plans for all the aspects in your project that you need. Now, in big and complicated projects, those can be lots of things, right? You can actually create up to 20 management plan. In the PMBOK guide, they basically indicate, I think, up to 18, but there is more to that, actually. There is no limit, actually. You can plan for anything in the project that needs actually to be planned for. Okay, so these are the subsidiary plans. Yes, all the documents and all the project management plan, again, that we will mention in this course, you can check their forms in the book of forms, as we mentioned in the last lecture, right? So these are the subsidiary plans. Now, again, if your project is simple, is small project that consists of, I don't know, 2 or 3 persons working on developing an application, then you don't probably need that to develop all of these subsidiary plans. You might need only to develop a scope, schedule, and cost, and that's it. But for complicated and large projects, you might end up developing 20 plans or more than 20 plans, subsidiary plans, for anything in the project, for how to manage anything in the project. Now, again, notice when we say plan, what do we mean by plan? We mean how to do this, basically the who's and how's. So scope management plan, how are we going to develop the scope? Who will develop the scope? Who is responsible for tracking the scope? How will we validate the scope, for instance? How will we report the scope? Who will report the scope? And so on. Okay, so this is the plan of anything. The plan of anything is how are we going to do this? Is that correct? Okay. Why the baselines? Now this is the another part of the plan, of the project management plan, which is the baselines. You develop a scope management plan, for instance, for how to develop a scope and who is responsible for developing a scope and so on. But when you create the scope and approve it from the management and the customer, then this scope becomes a baseline. So it's like an approved version that cannot be changed from now on without a formal change request, because this remarks the approved version of the scope. And against this approved version, we will measure the performance. When we start executing the project, we will compare what's happening actually against the approved version. And this comparison will help me measure the performance of the project, because I have the approved version and I have now what's happening in the real life. Okay, for that reason, we need a baseline that we can compare against. So performance measurement is done by comparing the baseline with actuals. And baseline is, of course, what? Again, the approved version. Now, is there a baseline in Agile? No. Because Agile, what? Welcomes change anytime. And we don't need to do the kind of documentation, updating the documentation every time we change. No, anytime you want to change something within, again, the approach, within the protocols of the approach, for instance, as we mentioned in the Scrum, then you're welcome to change. You don't have to submit a formal change request, and you don't have to get approvals from the governance board, and you don't have to defend your change request and why to prove it's important. No, not at all. Okay? No. The product backlog is a lightweight document that does not need an approval from any entity, that is owned by the product owner, who can change it anytime within the protocols. Okay? It's not a baseline at all. We don't have baselines in Agile. Okay? Same goes for the schedule. When you develop a schedule and you approve it from the management or from the customer, then you have now a baseline that you can use to measure performance, again, with actuals. Same for the cost. When you develop a cost baseline in a project budget, you can use this to compare, again, the baseline with the actuals and measure performance in cost. And if you take the three of them, the scope, schedule, cost, and integrate them, as we will see later on, you get a performance measurement baseline that you can use in order to measure the performance in the project as a whole. As a whole means the scope, the schedule, the cost of the project. So you get those performance indexes like the CPI, SPI that we will explain later on. Okay. So these are the components of the project management plan. Again, the project management plan consists of subsidiary plans and baselines. The number of subsidiary plans depend on the project need and the tailoring concept that we have explained, right? Tailoring here is very important. Now you and the team need to decide what are the necessary project management plans that you need to develop, and what project management plans are not necessary and you don't need to develop. Baselines will be always actually there in the traditional approaches, of course. You need to develop all the time scope baseline, schedule baseline, and cost baseline, and of course, performance measurement baseline. Okay, does that make sense? Everything is clear so far? In addition to that, the project management plan can also contain a description of the life cycle that we will use. So it can indicate that this project is gonna be managed using the predictive approach or the iterative approach or hybrid approach. We will manage phase 1 in a waterfall approach, and we will manage phase 2 in an agile approach, for instance. Okay, as well as work explanation. So how are we going to execute the activities, as well as tailoring results. So what are the processes that we will use in the project? Because again, I might not use all of the 49 processes that we explained. I might only need to use 32 or I don't know, 35 of those processes. So project management processes, tailoring, level of implementation, what are the tools and techniques that I will use in the project, and how the processes will be used to manage the project. Okay, does that make sense? So again, it's how and who are we going to execute, monitor, control, and close the project. Now, as a project manager, are you going to be able to develop all of the plans needed? Are you an expert of all of the technicalities of the work that needs to be executed? Do you is it necessary that you are an expert in the product and how the product is developed? No, again, your main expertise and your main role in the project is to manage, right? The management skills, the project management skills, the project management processes. You are not an expert probably in all of the aspects of the product development. And for that reason, and in order to be able to successfully plan and correctly plan for the project different aspects, you need to consult all the time with who? With experts. So this is a very important tool that you need to use basically all the time while you manage your project, while you plan for your project, while you monitor and control your project, or while you close your project as well. Expert judgment is a tool that you will always need to use, because you always need to seek an advice from subject matter experts, people who are experts in this product-related aspect in the application area. Okay, so it's very important to seek their help. Now, some of the project managers think that this is a sign of weaknesses. If we consult experts, if I consulted some of my project team, then that indicates that I am weak. That's completely wrong, actually. It's a sign of confidence. If you're not confident, you don't seek their advices, right? But you're confident of what you know, which are the project management skills, and you're also confident of your people, of your team. You're confident in their skills, you're confident in their expertise, and for that reason, you seek their advices, you seek their judgment, right? Does that make sense? So basically, whenever you want to develop a plan, any plan, whether it's a schedule management plan, scope management plan, cost management plan, whatever plan you are developing, these are the tools that you will use to develop your plans. Expert judgment becomes number one, right? You seek to consult your team or even experts, external experts from outside the team or even from outside the organization, wherever you need to consult and whoever you need to consult as expert, you consult them. Consulting is very important to get to know, the best, to get to make the best decisions in your project. So you can do an expert judgment to determine the appropriate methodology approach to customize the processes to meet your project need, to develop technical and management details, to determine resources needed and skills needed, to define the level of configuration management, to identify what the project documents that will be affected by a certain decision and so on, to prioritize the work and so on, whatever you need. Okay, for that reason you have team of experts, and you can also consult even people or experts from outside of your team. Okay, so this is the first and most important tool, expert judgment. Second, while you're planning and developing the different plans in your project management plan, you might need, of course, to gather some data and gather some insights and gather some inputs from the team and from the stakeholders. So you can do brainstorming, for instance. You can go back to the previous project files and make checklists of the things that you need to make sure that you have covered in your plan. You might want to do a focus group to meet with stakeholders and experts and discuss a specific subject, quality, for instance, and quality requirements in the project, and how to, or what are the metrics that we need to include in our quality management plan. You might need to interview some of the experts, some of the stakeholders in order to gather the requirements. Okay, so all of these are tools to gather data that will help you develop the project management plan. And again, while you do this, you need to use your interpersonal and team skills. You're dealing with people. So there might be some conflicts. There might be some different perspectives. There might be, I don't know, some politics, right? So you need to know how to manage conflicts, for instance, how to facilitate meetings, and how to drive people into consensus. Meetings itself is a tool also that you use because you meet all the time with different stakeholders in order to gather data, in order to seek their judgment, and you develop the plan. Okay, so meeting is also a tool to develop project management plan. Now remember that 90% of the project manager time is spent in what? Is spent in communication. Is that correct? I think you heard that before. So 90% of the project manager time is spent in communicating with the stakeholders. Okay. Of course, yes, conflict management is a subject that we will cover in details later on when we discuss executing the project, because most of the conflicts take place at the execution phase. Okay. Okay. Now, if you go back, let me go back to the process chart, the 49 processes. So this is the 49 processes, right? Remember those. The process chart based on the 6th version. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the largest group is the planning group, right? Because it covers, again, you should plan for all the aspects of your project. Now, some of the plans are clear what aspect they cover. For instance, you have here, again, the processes to plan for the scope. Here are the processes to plan for the schedule. Here are the processes to plan for the cost and so on. But some plans actually don't relate to only one aspect in the project. Take, for instance, the change management plan. Whenever you change something in the project, the change that you make is not going to affect only one aspect of the project. If you change something in the scope, for instance, then this will also be reflected on the schedule, right? It will also be reflected on the cost. It will be also, might be also reflected on the quality. So for that reason, for instance, the change management plan, you don't find here a specific process that is labeled plan change management, because change is not something that will affect only one aspect of the project. No, it's an integration aspect that is gonna be reflected to all or to different aspects in the project. Okay, so for that reason, we have specific processes for specific plans, like here: plan scope management, plan schedule management, plan cost management, plan quality management. Now here you have a plan, a subsidiary plan that is specific to that, knowledge area. This is a quality management plan. It's specific to quality. But for other plans, like the change management plan, like the compliance management plan that we have mentioned, you need to comply with different legal and regulatory requirements and environmental probably requirements and so on. This is something that relates to different aspects, not only to quality or not only to scope. So it's an integrational plan. So change management plan, compliance management plan, other plans that we will see later on are considered what? Integrational plans, okay? And they're not specifically mentioned here in specific processes. For instance, we have here the configuration management plan and the configuration management. Now this will take some time, so let's take again 15 minutes break and get back to explain the configuration management and other plans as well. Are we getting questions regarding tools and techniques? No, I mentioned that earlier. You will not get questions. You might get 1 or 2 questions. You might get 1 or 2 maximum questions about tools, techniques, inputs, outputs. Tools probably, you might get 1 or 2 questions about tools. But tools are important for you to understand how to use and how to apply, because you might get scenarios, you know, and you need to select the right tool to apply in the scenario. So you need to understand what are the tools and how to use them and how to apply them. Okay, but direct questions, you don't get probably direct questions about them. Okay, excellent. So 15 minutes and we will get back to you, inshallah. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everyone, and we continue explaining the development of the project management plan. So again, you find here the name of the process that we are discussing now, which is to develop a project management plan. And again, project management plan is or consists of subsidiary plans and baselines. It's not only one plan, it's actually several management plans and several baselines. And it describes how the project work will be executed, how the project will be monitored and controlled, and how the project will be closed. So we are talking about some plans that don't relate actually to only one specific aspect of the project, but relate to different aspects. So we mentioned, like, for instance, the configuration management plan, the change management plan, the compliance management plan, and we will discuss some of these here. Now let's start by the configuration management. What is configuration management and why do we need configuration management in the project? The configuration management is a tool that is used to manage changes to the product or to the related documents. And by the way, we use the term artifact. So project artifacts are project documents and deliverables, or even part of those deliverables. We call these artifacts. And why we call them artifacts? Because after the project is finished, you still have these artifacts, the project documents and the project deliverables. And at any point at time in future, you can go back to those artifacts, to the documents and deliverables, and you can understand how this project took place and what were the deliverables of this project. It's like when you go and do some digging, you know, looking for ancient cultures. So what you find when you dig for ancient cultures, you find artifacts. And those artifacts that you find in the, you know, in those sites tells you exactly how those people used to live, how those people used to build their houses, what kind of civilization that they had, and so on, right? And this is the same here. So for that reason, they use, especially in Agile, they tend to use this term, which is artifact, to express any document, project document, or deliverable, or part of deliverable. Now again, configuration management is about making sure that those artifacts are updated all the time. So they are current, because especially if you have a large number of documents and a large number of deliverables, and those might be updated while we work in the project, then some of these updates can, slip in the crack. And some of these updates can not be reflected on other aspects. So we updated the scope, but we forgot, for instance, to update the schedule. We updated the specification of the product, but we forgot to reflect that on the scope. It happens, right? If you don't take care, then you might get this problem of updating certain documents and forgetting about other documents, or updating the product attributes or the product configuration and forgetting to reflect that on the project documents that relate to that. And for that reason, we need to use the configuration management. So again, the objective of configuration management is to make sure that all project documents and all project deliverables are up to date, are current, and there is no conflicts between the documents and the deliverables and the product specifications and configurations that we have, right? And in large projects, I think probably some of you know that in large documents, in large construction projects, for instance, they set up a department, specific department, to manage the updates of the documents, and they call it document management control, DMC, because it's very important. We need to make sure that all project documents, all project blueprints, all project drawings, all project specifications are up to date. Otherwise, we will have a lot of issues. Some people working on old specifications, other people are working on current specifications, blueprints are different from one team to another, and so on, right? For that reason, for that specific reason, we need to do configuration management, and probably we need to plan for it, right? So for that reason, we might include in the project management plan, we might include a configuration management plan. So the configuration management plan, again, is an integration plan that describes who and how we will manage the configurations in the project, right? So what work products need to be managed, how these products will be created, stored, revised, documented, archived, authorization levels, so who is allowed to update all of these specifications or details or blueprint, what are the authorization levels, naming schemes for different documents, for different type of revisions. For that reason, we have the version control, right? I think you probably done some version control. Whenever you alter a document, you give it a new number, right? A new version number, to make sure that you are tracking the changes in the document, right? And you use a specific, probably a specific naming scheme, where you start, for instance, the 3 letters start with the organization name, and then you use 2 letters to express, for instance, the month, and then 2 letters to express the day, and I don't know, 2 letters to express the author name. So you have a certain or specific naming scheme that you use while tracking the changes in the documents and in the specifications of the product, right? And discusses release management for products that will be released incrementally. So for every increment, there is what, again, tracking for this increment and giving a name or a number for the update that has happened to the product, or has happened to the features and functions of the product, and so on. So we call this the configuration management plan. Again, the who's and how's of how to do configuration management in the project, how to make sure that all project artifacts are up to date, are current, and who will do that, okay? Now, luckily, all modern project management information systems such as Microsoft Project and Oracle Primavera and other tools as well have this feature integrated with them. So whenever, for instance, you update a document in Microsoft Project or in SharePoint portal, it will be stamped automatically by the date that the document was uploaded and the time. And then when someone updates the document, the system will automatically assign a new version number and will put a stamp again on who modified this document and when did they modify this document, and will keep track of this modification. So for instance, if I access a document and see it was version 10 and I wanted to know how this document looked like in version 8, I can do that. I can go back to version 8 and see and compare what were the modifications that has been made between version 8 and version 10. So this capabilities is fortunately now included in any modern project management information system. For instance, the version control. And that makes, of course, the life of the project manager a lot easier, because I remember like 20 years ago, we needed to do that manually. We had that header in every document that we used in project management. We had to put a header. And in that header, we included the information about the version control. What is the version number, who modified the version, what date it was modified, and so on. But now we don't need anymore to do that, because we have this robust project management information system to help us. Another thing that these systems actually now help us with is the storage of and distribution of the artifacts. Because now most of these systems, as you know, give you a space on the clouds that you can store your documents at. So you're not worried, for instance, if God forbid you had a fire in the working site or in the office, if you have a disaster in the working site or the office, because all of the documents are stored somewhere on some server in in the United States, and it's backed up, so you don't have to worry at all about your documents, right? Tools like Google Drive, Dropbox, and the likes made also the life easier, because they have this ability to give you storage on the cloud. It's very easy to distribute the artifacts, the documents, any way that you want, to give access to people only by sharing links, to give them authorization levels, and also to keep track of the modification of those artifacts. You can also do version control with Google Drive or with Dropbox and the likes. So now, again, it has become a lot easier for project managers to do this configuration management using those modern systems. Okay. So this will help us avoid unnecessary administrative overhead that we usually had to do. It also helps us have standardized formats and templates of the documents that we use in the project. It's a structured process for review and approval for the documents. So you can also create flow charts for those documents. For anyone that needs to, for instance, update any document, they need to follow a workflow, and they need to obtain approvals from different people in the team before they can update the document. Okay, those systems again provide version control and security, and we can use them to timely distribute any documents. Very easy to distribute any document to any stakeholders that you want. Okay. So this was about the configuration management plan. Another management plan that relates to integration, that is not actually specific to any of the project specific or aspects, is the change management plan. And the change management plan, as the name explains itself, is about who and how to manage changes in the project. So, for instance, who can propose a change in the project? Now, the general rule is that any stakeholder in the project can propose a change, but In certain projects, you might want to change this general rule and allow only specific stakeholders to request changes or to propose changes. And what exactly constituted change? How do you define change? When is it considered change? What is the impact of the change on the project objectives? What steps are necessary to evaluate change requests? So you can describe that as well in the change management plan. How change requests are approved and what documents should be amended. For instance, what are the actions that we need to monitor to confirm that these changes have been completed or not. So again, it's the who's and how's of change management. So you might need also a change management plan. Again, you might need, you might not need. This depends on the project size, on the project complexity, and the project criticality, and so on. But in big complex project, of course, you need a change management plan. How to manage changes in the project, who and how, right? So again, this is an integrational plan. Another plan that also is an integrational plan that does not relate to a specific aspect of the project is the project implementation plan, which describes again how we will implement the product at the client side when we finish the project. So this might need also a plan because implementing a product needs planning. You need to make sure that the environment is ready at the customer's side. You need to make sure that the customer is ready to receive this product. You need probably to train the customer to use that product. You need probably to provide the customer with support or warranty about the product. You might need to decommission some old systems at the project side. You need to probably give some knowledge transfer sessions to the customer before they can receive the product and so on. So this might also need what? A plan, and you need to develop a project implementation plan. And this is also again a subsidiary of the project management plan. Okay, so all of these plans again can be integrated in the project management plan. Transition artifacts, you might need to develop transition artifacts and you need to set a plan for that. So I need to develop training documents, training materials, presentation, how to use brochures, catalogs for the products and so on. So you might also need to plan for the artifacts that you will use while you transition the product to the client. So this again might constitute another plan that you need to develop as a part of the project management plan. Okay. So these are all examples of the subsidiary management plans that you might need to develop as part of the project management plan. Again, this depends, the number of subsidiary plans that you need to develop depends on the complexity and size of the project that you are working on, okay? Here are some guidelines as well. Review the project charter. Now, this is very important. Any plan that you are developing should not conflict with the project charter. The project charter is the primary and the most important document of the project that we cannot modify again, and we cannot have something that conflicts with the boundaries that it has set. So when you develop any project management plan, you need to make sure that the project management plan that you have developed does not contradict with the project charter, does not conflict with the project charter, okay? When you develop some of the project management plans, you need to look at other project management plans. So the outputs of certain processes become inputs to other processes. The scope will become developed to developing a schedule. The schedule will become input to developing a cost. The cost will become an input to develop, for instance, the quality management plan, and so on. So Some outputs will be or will become input to other processes. And the objective here is to make sure again that all the plans that we will develop integrate well and don't have any sort of conflicts between them or among them. Okay, so we need to make sure that all the plans at the end of the day integrate in a one master project management plan. You need also to take and to make sure that you take the EEFs, the enterprise environmental factors, and OPAs into consideration while you plan for all the aspects. EEFs and OPAs are very important to take into consideration. You need to use the proper tools and techniques for developing these plans and these baselines. You need to use facilitation techniques again, because you will be interviewing a lot of customers, you will be doing expert judgments, meeting experts, subject matter experts, doing focus groups, doing workshops. So you need to practice facilitation techniques as well. You need to document the plan, of course, and approve it when it's finished, so it becomes a baseline. And you need also to assess incremental delivery options. Now, this is a preferred option all the time, even if you are working with a traditional approach. If there is an opportunity to deliver the product incrementally, then this is a preferred option, especially for the customer, because again, it makes the customer feel a quick return on investment when they see that you are delivering to them a product that is working, even if it's not working with the full functions and features that they requested, but they can see that it's growing just before their eyes, right? So it's very important. If you can have this option, then this is a preferred option, if you can build the product incrementally, okay? The project artifacts, again, this term is going to be used throughout the course. It means any document related to the management of the project that the team will create and update all the time, and also any part of the deliverables or products of the project. The documents again are considered living documents, and they are updated continuously throughout the project life cycle. And this includes all the documents except, again, the project charter, because it can't be updated once approved. Okay? Now, there are certain artifacts that relate only to agile projects. Now, again, as we mentioned, agile projects use lightweight documentation. They don't use comprehensive documentation. And these are the common documents that we use in agile projects. The product backlog, which contains the user stories, the Apex user stories, functions, features, as we explained earlier in the last, I think, lecture. So the product backlog representing the scope of the project, the product increment. So in every iteration, we add features, right? We add a new layer of feature and function. We call this the product increment. So this is also an artifact. The product roadmap that we also explained earlier, the product vision statement as well, the release plan, the sprint backlog, which is the backlog related to this iteration or to this sprint specifically. These are the agile artifacts. And notice there are only, how many artifacts we have here? Like 6 only artifacts. It's a lightweight documentation. Okay. Any question, gentlemen, ladies? Okay. From now on, we will start discussing how we develop each of those subsidiary plans that we have mentioned. Okay. So if we go back again to the process chart, now we will go deep into details in planning, and we will start discussing how to develop the plan for all of the aspects of the project, right? So developing the plan for the scope, developing the plan for the schedule, and so on. But what do you think? What should we start with? Should we start with developing the plan for the scope, or developing the plan for the schedule, or developing the plan for the budget and cost? What do you think is the preferred option? Yeah. Now, most project managers indeed will start planning for the scope. Okay, because all other things basically rely on the scope, right? If you want to develop a schedule, then you need to know what is the scope of work. If you need to develop the cost and budget, then you again need, or you depend on the scope, right? So is the quality and so on. But integration, we finished integration, right? We finished discussing the develop project management, the integration, because we mentioned it consists of several subsidiary plans and baselines, and they will be integrated when we finish developing all the subsidiary plans. They are all integrated in one project management plan. Okay. But what makes more sense is to start with what? To start with what we finished earlier. Earlier, we finished with what? When we finished the initiation of the project, the last thing we discussed is what? The identification of the stakeholders, right? Okay, so when we start planning, how about, and based on the identification and analysis that we done in the stakeholders, in the stakeholder register, how about we start planning for stakeholder engagement, right? Especially that the scope also, and the scope planning will depend on gathering requirements from stakeholders. So if stakeholders are not properly engaged and involved, I will have difficult time gathering their requirements and developing my scope based on their requirements. Is that correct or not? So the best option might be is to start with planning their engagement and involvement, and having this proper level of engagement and involvement before we go and start collecting their requirements and developing a scope based on their requirements. I think that makes more sense. And for that reason, actually, this is what we will start with. So in the next lecture, inshallah, we will start with developing a stakeholder engagement plan. And then we will follow by planning for the scope and developing a scope baseline, and then planning for the schedule and developing a schedule baseline, and planning for the cost and developing a cost baseline, and so on, until we finish all the subsidiary plans and we integrate them, and all the baselines and we integrate them. Okay, does that make sense to you? Now, another important thing before we finish this lecture is that if you notice, all the time when we start planning for any aspect of the project, we start with the plan, right? For instance, here, plan stakeholder engagement, plan scope management, plan schedule management, plan cost management, plan quality management, plan resource management, and so on. And this makes sense actually, because before you start doing anything, you need a plan for it, right? So for this reason, for instance, before developing a schedule, you need to put a plan on how to develop the schedule and who will develop the schedule and so on, who will track the schedule. And for this reason, we need a scope management plan, right? And it's the same for the schedule. We need to start with a schedule management plan. And the same for the cost. We need to start with a cost management plan, who and how we will do the costing and budgeting of the project, and who will track that, and who will report that, and how we will report it, and so on. Right? Does that make sense to you? Okay, great. Any question, ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude this session? Great. Thank you all, and see you next Sunday, inshallah. Have a nice evening, and wish you all the best. and السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.